All right, we'll get started with the podcast recording momentarily, but let's begin here with the ceremonial making of the faces for the thumbnail. The Minnesota Timberwolves current luxury tax commitments.
The Minnesota Timberwolves season that they just finished.
Whether the Wolves should trade Karl-Anthony Towns. All right, let's start this baby. All right, welcome on to a Sunday night edition of Dunc'd On. Thanks so much for joining us here on YouTube. If you haven't yet, please give us a subscribe or a like, and of course, some comments. We'll take a few of those as well as we're going through here discussing the offseason first for the Minnesota Timberwolves, Danny. And we were talking just before we came on the air about now that Anthony Edwards has gotten his 30% max contract. Karl-Anthony Towns is kicking in at 35% of the salary cap. So they will be, as it stands now, quite expensive next season.
Quite expensive indeed. And the big number for the second apron, as things stand right now with the estimate, is roughly $189.5 million. That is the second apron threshold. As of right now, without a full roster, the Minnesota Timberwolves are around $195 million. So they're over the second apron. That includes nothing for Monte Morris, Kyle Anderson, Jordan McLaughlin. It does include their draft pick. And that's I think that's 11 players that it would have under roster. So as currently constructed, the Minnesota Timberwolves would be remarkably expensive for the 2024-25 season. And you and I mean, we've talked about this a lot over the course of time, the financial cataclysm that's coming. And I wrote a piece for The Athletic talking about the ownership dynamic that actually came out on Sunday. And, no new reporting. But basically my thesis with this is we haven't seen, like, this is a gigantic jump in a team's expenditures, but this is the type of team that you spend that kind of money to have.
Yeah, and that's where I want to start momentarily. But I think just to get a little bit more into the consequences of being in the second apron for this team. Now, the tax regime is one of the few things that is not kicking in until next year. So they actually were under the old tax regime still. So the way the new one works is it gets like crazy expensive. Basically, once you get more than 15 million over the tax, which is a couple million below the second apron. As of now, it still goes up by quite a bit, but you don't have basically like the marginal cost of a dollar doubles between under 15 million, over 15 million, which is about what it is under the new regime that starts in 25, 26. I thought it was telling, by the way, in the negotiations that the owners don't care about the system stuff. They don't care about the competitiveness on the floor and like whether it's fair to have the rules change so quickly for some of these teams, like say the Suns that built their teams with the expectation of the old regime. Oh, but if you actually have to pay some money, yeah, we're going to bring those in much more slowly, right? Like that's actually going to mess up. I mean, it's an old joke among people in these CBA circles of just like, in the end, like GMs, teams being competitive or not being competitive always get like complete short shrift, but anything that actually costs the owners money is, of course, going to be a negotiating priority for them.
Yeah, congratulations. Yeah. Where we're going to have 5 two-ways in a couple CBAs.
Yeah, now this would be one of the bigger tax bills for a team of this market size, but not unprecedented, right? This is about where the Bucks have been the last couple of years. They don't really have a particularly easy way to cut money. They also have Jaden McDaniels kicking in next year as well. And even if the cap goes up more than expected, both Towns and Edwards extensions are actually tied to the cap, so they probably benefit less from that. Of course, they did get Conley on a great value extension, about $10 million a year for the next 2 years. And they've got a few free agents. They got Kyle Anderson, they got Monte Morris. Those are the most likely ones. But really, I don't see anyone other than Naz Reid or Towns that they realistically could cut to save some money. Now, one way that they could get out of this hell next year would be if Rudy Gobert were to decline his player option and take less over a much longer period. So I think that there is maybe some hope that, they're not just like committing to this for the long term. But the other thing too is just like you said, they are really good. It's the type of team that you do spend money for. Before we get into that aspect of it, though, also we'll talk about the system issues, right? I mean, that's the thing that the owners want to hide behind generally, of like, oh, well, it doesn't make sense to pay as much anyway because we'll be so constrained, right? And those constraints are not that bad just for this year, right? Your draft pick does get frozen in 2030. Your 2032 pick gets frozen if you finish the year over the second apron, which they would happen. It would be tough for them to get out of it if they kind of go into the year thinking they're going to be in it, unlike maybe some other teams like that we've talked about recently. And then, so that's your major consequence. And, there's all this other stuff like, you can't aggregate salary, you can't add salary, you can't use cash, all that stuff. They weren't really going to do any of that stuff anyway. Probably. I mean, they're not, if they're this expensive, they wouldn't even be using the tax mid-level. And to just duck under the second apron barely, you're not going to duck under the second apron so you can then use the tax mid-level to get back up near it and be hard capped against that. So all of that is my way of saying, if they decide to cut salary, I would consider it mostly a money-focused move, because you can always unfreeze that draft pick later by getting out later. And as I've teased several times now, they are at the point where they are, in theory, good enough that you just can't fuck around with making your team significantly worse to save money if you're actually being a competent ownership.
Yeah, if you're a serious team, is one way of putting it. And so they are expensive. And as you mentioned, and I think it's a really potentially important point with Gobert, where he could do what Drew Holiday's done, what Draymond Green and a few others have done, is take less money and do it over a longer period of time. And
yeah, but that's the next offseason again, just in case people. I know you know that, but just in case we're
to be abundantly clear. Yeah, and so for Minnesota, as you mentioned, I think that the primary tenet is there aren't ways to make this team significantly cheaper that don't significantly reduce either their talent level or their upside. And so even if someone wants to posit that Naz Reid is close enough to Karl-Anthony Towns, where offloading Karl-Anthony Towns or significantly reducing, using him in that sort of a fashion to reduce your bill, like, it doesn't make you as much worse as another thing because you have a functional replacement. It still makes you worse. And it makes you worse. And it's the same basic idea of trading Reid and keeping Towns. Is we saw how valuable having both of those players on their roster was this year. When Karl-Anthony Towns missed time, we weren't even sure that he was going to be back, much less in the form he was in the first two rounds after the meniscus surgery. And so having both of them as a redundancy for each other, they have an unusual skill set, but they tie together really well for that exact purpose. And the idea that having both Towns and Reid reduces the pressure on each of them because you have Gobert and you have kind of these other defenders and everything else. So there's an outside chance, of course, that another team would be so interested in either Towns or Reid that they make you a foolishly strong offer that makes you better. Is that possible? Of course it is. Do I expect it to happen? No. I don't think that there's that a team is like, Naz Reid, he's our like third best player. We're going to acquire him as our third best player. For Towns, you'd have to even modify that significantly because of how much money he makes and everything else. So it's overwhelmingly likely, if not virtually certain, that any move the Wolves would make to shed salary, because they just don't have any other salary, would make them significantly worse.
Yeah, it seems that way. And particularly when you consider Towns' contract, which if they weren't competitive right now for actually maybe winning the championship, I would be pushing much harder on them to trade Towns to do it while you still can, right?
Sure.
Because this will be his age 29 season coming up. And yeah, he's making 35% of the salary cap. I mean, it's just a massive number. Starts at 49 million, ends with 61 million. And those he's going up 8% raises while the cap's going up 10. That's not going to save you that much over that time. And of course, he has a player option in the last year of his deal. So, and okay, yeah, you might say, all right, we're going to move Towns, bring Reed in the starting lineup. All right. Oh, by the way, and I guess we'll re-sign Kyle Anderson then. And, maybe we get someone back for Towns who's like, kind of more of a shooting four or something along those lines. Like let's say they were to, now this team has their own tax concerns, of course, so there would have to be a third team for some money. But let's say they move Karl-Anthony Towns to Portland for Jeremy Grant, right? Like that, and so someone pays someone that there's more matching salary that goes off Portland's books, since they're hilariously also in the tax. And so like that to me makes this team worse, right? So you're probably not going to start Reed at that point. Maybe you start Grant, but then all right, you go up against the Nuggets. Who's going to guard Jokic? Like they have the advantage of having a very good matchup, probably the best matchup in the NBA, with Towns actually like big enough to kind of bang with Jokic and not just get put in the goal and then Gobert behind him. And yeah, they didn't match up very well against Dallas. I don't know that would go better for them next year, but hey, like Dallas may not be their opponent. Dallas could have an injury next year. During the regular season, you might have an injury perhaps. And so if you're like, you move on from Towns, now you need another backup big behind Reed. Oh, by the way, Reed only has one more year left on his deal, and you'd have to give him probably a big raise with that player option for 25, 26. And so you're kind of like, and I think just whoever they acquire isn't going to be as talented as Karl-Anthony Towns. Could that allow them to play maybe a little more modern style? Probably. But whoever they get is not going to be, like, maybe it could make you a little better defensively against a lot of teams because you have one more guy who can guard Luka, you do more switching. But then also, like, whoever you get is not going to be as good an offensive player as Karl-Anthony Towns as a shooter or a driver. And, like, Naz Reid is your second best offensive player. Like, that's not good enough. Like, that's not a good enough team. I think, to me, what you're thinking is let's maintain our defense. And with growth from Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns and everyone just understanding how to play together a little better, maybe we could try to find one more shooter somehow, that our offense gets way better. Our defense stays best in the league. And now we're like even more of a contender.
Mm-hmm. And the other big problem with moving Towns is that you think about the Wolves having a longer window because of the youth of Anthony Edwards, only 22 years old. Mike Conley at some point is going to age out of being a player on this team. And first of all, replacing him financially is going to be hard, but also just that if you replace Towns with Reed, then you put a lot more on Anthony Edwards' shoulders, both in the present and in the future. And so maintaining your status as a contender gets even more difficult. And so that's another stress point that you're going to have to deal with. It is entirely possible that Edwards becomes so good that doesn't become a concern, but there are floor and ceiling concerns for trading Karl-Anthony Towns.
I completely agree with that. And then the other thing I'll say too is, you know what, like if they had never made the Gobert trade, I would totally understand maybe trading Karl-Anthony Towns.
Mm-hmm.
But not only did they make the Gobert trade, but they also gave Karl Towns a designated player or designated veteran player extension. Dan had that abbreviation in our sheet today that I was reminded of. It's not designated player veteran extension. And so you do that, you make the Gobert trade. That's all on the basis that you think you can win right now. And as we've gone through rendering a month-by-month verdict on that trade, and it looked terrible last year, and now I think it actually looks great. Like people are like saying, oh, like we still have to determine the verdict. No, like the fact they made the conference finals, like they the trade is a success. And the only way they could turn it into a failure is by then not taking this group to its logical endpoint when they showed so much growth and so much promise this year. If you then cut that group off at the knees by moving Karl-Anthony Towns now, and I think, yeah, you know what? Like, Karl-Anthony Towns had moments where he wasn't great in the playoffs. He also had moments where he's really good against Denver. He's much better in these playoffs than he was 2 years ago. So another couple of years of him in his prime, like, maybe he can give you more in the future. And like, that's the premise that this entire team is built on. And so, yeah, you know what? Like, Karl-Anthony Towns is going to be an albatross in a couple of years. And that could be a problem. Naz Reid could leave, and you might be worse the year after next. But, like, you built this team to win right now. That was the entire reason you made the Gobert trade. You're ready to win right now. So you just, like, got to damn the torpedoes in the future because you already did that.
Yes. And I do think if I were in Tim Connolly's shoes, presuming that he is the decider here.
Yes.
That I would listen on Towns, because I don't, first of all, my general thesis is that there are very few truly untradeable players in the league, like that I would hang up on just automatically. But it's hard for me to imagine that kind of deal manifesting. Like, I mean, sure, could a team like the Knicks or the Thunder or somebody be so interested in Towns that they give you not only positive value, but give you positive value in ways that either shore up your weaknesses or create new strengths. Like, maybe you could get a theoretical deal from a team that involved a young player that you thought was a wonderful backcourt complement for Anthony Edwards in the present and future. I'm not going to foreclose on that possibility. I think that's why you always listen. I do not expect it to happen.
So let's talk a little bit more about what they can do here. Now, I mean, Anderson, I'm sure they would love to bring him back, but even doing it at the salary that he is already at, just to give you an idea of how much money it would cost if you wanted to just throw him on the books at what he's making now, which is $8 million or so. I guess he's making $9 million now. We'll call it $9 million as I enter it into the trusty spreadsheet here. And boom, now your tax goes from 60 million to 90 million, in addition to adding the 9 million in salary that you're actually paying him. So yeah, that seems like it would be pretty prohibitively expensive. You know, they do have Alexander Walker.
I'm not going to crush the Wolves for that kind of a choice if they keep the other stuff together.
No, I wouldn't either. And Alexander Walker is there for $4 million. He can be a free agent after next year. So can Naz Reid, as we talked about. And so, you know what? It may, and you might get relief with Gobert. You might not. He could just opt out and leave as a free agent after next year too. But, and hey, you know what? Maybe next year you take a step back, you lose in the first round, and it just doesn't make sense to keep paying this. Oh, by the way, your ownership situation has now been resolved as well. There's actually talk that might happen. The arbitration could be done by the end of the summer. That would surprise me if it's that fast, but apparently the arbitration panel has been selected, and maybe there's are certain provisions in the sale agreement that the arbitration has to happen within a certain amount of time. But generally, and hopefully there just won't be that much discovery. Like, that's what takes so long in litigation, is discovery of all the documents and witnesses and depositions and all that stuff. So maybe there just isn't that much of that to be determined, and the ownership situation will be resolved. It does strike me, though, that Glenn Taylor, who will be making these decisions, he does not want to be the guy who's going to, like, trade away Karl-Anthony Towns after a season like this.
It's the reverse. It's the reverse of moral hazard in certain ways. If you feel the way that you and I do about the team, where it's like, you don't want to be the person who takes it out, and you might not be the one who has to pay it. So you might as well keep the spending up, get the praise while you're the owner. And then if somebody else has to eventually foot the bill and be the villain to cut it down, if that's what they want to do, great.
Yeah. And also, like, hey, he's getting paid the same amount regardless of whether their books are clean going forward or not too. Now, he's made a terrible deal, so he's not going to get paid that much. And we'll see. We'll see who ends up being the actual owner, but it will, in almost all certainty, be Glenn Taylor making that decision. And it would just, I mean, he obviously is a relatively incompetent owner, but it would seem quite crazy to me to make the decision that he did to pull out of this when you had still a willing buyer, and we'll see whether they actually can sustain that there was material breach or not. But it seems like he could have gone through with this and sold the team still if they. It's not like they literally didn't have the money. Like, they're fighting hard to get the team. Like, they're gonna have the money, and they could have paid him. He could have done it if he wanted to. He decided not to. You don't just make the decision to retain the team like that, unless and then like cut costs in this way. I mean, that would be truly deranged behavior, even for him.
I agree.
So I mean, obviously, if we had to talk about what they needed more, this has been a subject. I mean, they're going to need some kind of a backup for. I mean, someone to replace Anderson. Like, they're going to need one more guy who can defend on the wing. Like, right now, they have Jaden McDaniels, Edwards, who you don't really want doing that, and Alexander Walker. So a little bit more of a body there would be useful. Like, is that Josh Minott, or is that Leonard Miller, who's really more of a big?
Well, and is it briefly, if they're going to be a second apron team, any non-Timberwolf, any non-retention is a minimum contract.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, anyone that you're going to bring in has to be a minimum. Yeah, you can't sign and trade, can't do any of that. And I mean, this doesn't seem like the sort of team that's like, oh yeah, we're going to re-sign Monte Morris just to like the Suns were like, oh, we just need some tradable salary. Like, no. Now, they do have their number 27 overall pick that they could trade, and they could also attach a 2031 first, and they have swaps available in 28 and 30. So they could actually try to make a trade. And is it possible that they could actually upgrade the team by moving Towns and attaching something to Towns? That seems kind of unlikely to me. Like, I'm not sure what team is like desperately wants Karl-Anthony Towns. Like, could they, like, for the Nets, for example, like, you're not going to get Mikal Bridges back for Karl-Anthony Towns making double and with a way longer contract. Like, the Nets are trying to use cap space going forward. So I mean, I think you have to kind of retain as much as you just have the stomach for. I'm just, Monte Morris, maybe they could bring him back, but I don't know. He probably wants to go somewhere where he has more of a role. He didn't play at all in the playoffs. He's important in the regular season. They don't have a backup point guard under contract. Are there any guys just on the minimum market that appeal to you and are interested to be, to see if anyone in the comments wants to ask us about some people that might be on the minimum market that would be good fit for these guys too?
Javonte Green, I think, could be a nice little fit for them as a kind of a depth forward. I've liked him for a while.
Yeah. Wow, we're starting there, huh? Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton. Like, KJ Martin could be an interesting guy to come in that they could maybe groom under Chris Finch. Like, he's gotten athletic guys to play well for them. They probably have to offer like these 1+1s or something like that. Jay Crowder could be another guy that they could like take a look at in that spot. Like, there definitely are minutes available, right? And this assumes they don't retain Morris, they don't retain Anderson. And there's a few guys that like is Cam. We're always surprised every year that like some of these guys are below the minimum. So like, Cam Payne could be an interesting guy. I mean, I don't know how much Patty Mills has left, but he could be interesting to just like play next to Edwards in the regular season. He obviously would be too miserable defensively in the playoffs. So yeah, I mean, I don't think you want like a non-shooting type like a Dennis Smith Jr. or a Chris Dunn necessarily. I mean, maybe that like kind of brings you that other defender. And Chris Dunn, at least, he could shoot it about as well as Kyle Anderson, at least from three. He can't do as much inside the arc, but that might be an interesting thought. Like, they do have playing time to offer, which would be nice for them at least. I mean, certainly, I don't think that someone like Joe Ingles or Gordon Hayward would be trying to take the minimum necessarily, given who their agent is. So
I mean, maybe somebody like Damian Lee. Who's a shooter who didn't get the opportunities on Phoenix. He has a player option, but I'd rather be on Minnesota at the minimum than Phoenix, who clearly didn't play last year.
Yeah, Devontae Graham is a good one because he'll probably be hitting the market, and actually we need to add him to our list. So I mean, he's probably almost certainly going to get waived. So he and I think he actually does have something left. So yeah, he might be kind of along the lines. Like they're gonna just have to try some rehab projects, basically. Shake Milton, that's funny. Uh, since he already failed there.
Yeah. I mean, I could see them going after Marcus, one of the Morris twins, potentially as an option. I like as a depth 4 if they need one.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean Marcus, but Markieff
Mark.
might be even more. I mean Marcus Morris. The problem with him is that he just can only play like once a week. That's kind of the issue there.
Sure, and that's also. I mean, it is true that if they retain Townsend Reed, that you're looking for less from a backup 4 for them than most teams. But because like you don't even necessarily need them every game, but you need them at times to step up. Oh, I could see Keita. I don't know if he's going to get the minimum. Keita Bates-Diop could. I mean, he had a rough year in Phoenix, but
yeah. I mean, well, yeah, they've already had that, and so they already had him there for a little bit. Chuma Keke could be an interesting guy for them. I mean, now again, everybody always needs all these guys, right? The Kevin Love return to Minnesota. Maybe O'Shea Brissett, who's opted out of he can opt out of his player option and come in, and they could offer more of a role. But yeah, I mean, these are not amazing options by any means for them. And like, I think, could they, and I just don't know which of these guys eventually are going to be available for the minimum. Maybe they have to give them the 1+1 as well. I mean, we wouldn't have expected Lonnie Walker IV to be a 1+1 or just a straight minimum guy, or Malik Beasley. Right? You get guys like that. Yeah, like you probably actually would be totally fine replacements for Morris.
One other archetype I'd like to see the Wolves add, if they could, is a shot blocking center for when Gobert misses time. So, because that was something that came up when Gobert fouled out of that game against the Nuggets. The hard sales pitch is that player probably isn't going to play a lot. So the idea, you're probably not doing a young player who needs the exposure or something like that. But if it's basically the idea is you're a break glass in case of emergency type of player, and maybe that's of interest to somebody who's a little bit older, to a Bismack Biyombo, who's already in his 30s, or maybe to Daniel Tice even, who like kind of his red role. Now, some of those guys would probably, I don't think you're going to get Andre Drummond on that theory for sure, but you could potentially say like, hey, you get to be on this team. When we need you, we're going to really need you. You're going to make the same money as somewhere else, and you're going to probably play a little bit less.
Yeah, certainly they could use that archetype as well. Yeah, Spencer Dinwiddie has been thrown out there. I think his market will be a little better than that. Not sure.
I hope so.
Yeah. This is a good one from Hoops Comics. Could Toronto trade for Karl-Anthony Towns to be an ideal fit next to Barnes? Yeah, that is interesting. Now, are you also playing a center? Yeah, maybe not. I don't think Minnesota would want Pirtle back in that deal, but you could play Barnes at the 3 and Towns at the 4, and then maybe just not close the Pirtle. But yeah, I mean something along the lines of R.J. Barrett and Bruce Brown for Towns. Opted in Bruce Brown. Like that could be kind of interesting. Like Barrett is relatively cross-controlled. He does give you a second creator on the perimeter to help make up for the loss of Towns. And Brown would also give you another defender and just generally some more depth as well. So, or maybe even Kelly Olynyk could be in that trade instead of Brown if the Wolves need a little bit more savings. And to be clear, when you're in the second apron, you can't aggregate your own salaries together, but you can take back 2 guys who were aggregated, right? So if Towns makes 49 and Barrett and Brown make 46, or 40, yeah, they're pretty close to 49 actually, but you could take them back if you wanted to. So that would be potentially, or I think they could also just trade Towns before the draft at his old salary and just salary match there with bringing back his old salary, which is like 36, and then that so the other team wouldn't have like trouble matching salary if they were sending out 36 back. I wouldn't want to fuck with it, right? Like maybe that's a move that happens at the deadline if it's just not working out, or next off season. You never want to be in the situation where you have to trade the guy which is probably where they will be next offseason in all likelihood, unless they repeat the success of this year, which they could, but I mean, I think there are just a lot of teams in the West that are all kind of around that same level. So just the general odds of anyone else, of getting it back to the conference finals are not great. I don't know. Anything else we got to talk about for these guys?
No, I think that's about it.
All right, well, let's hit a little bit of news here, and that can eventually transition us into discussing the Sacramento Kings. I want to correct something that I said the other day when we were talking about Brian Keefe being brought on permanently in Washington, and that is that Wes Unseld actually is now Billy Donovan's lead assistant with Chicago. So obviously he's not in the his sunset role in the Wizards front office any longer. And let's see if there's any other news that we have to hit here.
Well, there's one thing I'd like to mention, just because it's an addendum to something we discussed previously, which is Mark Stein had a report on Sunday that the Pacers are expected to offer Andrew Nembhard a contract extension this offseason. And we didn't talk about the Nembhard extension when we did them. Basically, it's the question is whether the money they can offer is sufficient. Like, that's really the question with Nembhard. And so we can have that out there to complete that part of the story. 4 new years, about $78.4 million is the estimate that's out there. There is a little bit of wiggle room based on how things move over the next couple of months there. And so for Nembhard, like, it's significant money. You get it a year early, but is getting what is going to be below solid starter money for however many years the Pacers are willing to offer. Is that enough? And then the other note that Stein had, which is
quickly on him.
Sure.
So his situation right now is he's going into year 3. That is just a guaranteed number. Then he has a team option after that. So they could keep him at that number on year 4, which is basically the minimum, and do the extension to kick in after that. That then would only be a 3-year extension. That's what the Clippers did with Terrence Mann.
Correct.
Back in the day.
And I imagine Gafford years ago too.
Right, yeah. So I imagine the way this would work is the Pacers would say, okay, we'll decline your team option, but you got to give us a discount because we're taking you off of what would be a minimum salary and we're offering you like a reasonable salary. So we're basically giving you free money in that first year. So give us a discount over the entire life of the contract. So that's probably where that ends up.
And to be abundantly clear, the other consequence of the path that the Pacers might not take is by picking up that team option. If they don't extend off of that, then Nembhard becomes an unrestricted free agent in 2026 without an extension. So there is a risk there, but you could also mitigate that risk by an extension or anything else. And then the other note that Stein had, which I think is relevant here, is that Andrew Nembhard and Pascal Siakam have Todd Ramsar as their agent. So having a shared agent for your most prominent free agent this year and your most significant extension negotiation, there could be some confluence there.
All right, let's see if we got anything else we got to hit on. We should have mentioned this actually because this is something that was big news when it happened, that the NBA has closed their investigation regarding Josh Giddey involving allegations, which were not even any formalized. These are online allegations that he had an inappropriate relationship with an underage girl. Of course, the police had closed their investigation a while ago. They weren't able to corroborate any criminal activity, and so we are duty bound to do that. If we're going to say when the allegations have arisen, then you also have to say that they have been unsubstantiated. And then let's see, did we have anything else? I don't think we have anything else news wise that was particularly important. So let's talk about Mike Brown, who has signed an extension now with the Kings through much public posturing. First, there was the pause in negotiations, and then there was the restarting, and then, this is how far apart they are. And I think what finally allowed them to bridge the gap, I think that Vivek Ranadive was concerned about giving him a bunch of time. He had a mutual option after next year, and great job by Warren Legary negotiating that, because he knew that, because normally that would just be a team option for the team. for that 4th year, and he was being paid, I think somewhat under $5 million a year, which is at the time totally fine for him, given that he hadn't been a head coach in a while. But he's well exceeded that now. But if they had that 4th year team option, they would have been a totally different negotiating situation rather than having this mutual option, which is basically no deal at all, as we know, for the 4th year. So the coach being able to get out of it at that point was massive. And so what they ended up doing, I think Ron Adive was concerned about going out as many years as Bron would have liked, based on my kind of reading the tea leaves in the reporting. So they ended up actually, according to James Ham, giving Bron a bump in this upcoming year, which they didn't have to do. They had him under contract for like 4. Now he's getting a significant bump. We don't know how much that is. And then he's getting another 2 years at 8.5, which can go up to 10 with some team success incentives. So Mike Brown will be back. And I think that was an important deadline considering some of the other moves that they have to potentially make. So what's on the docket for the Kings here now that they have actually avoided being too dysfunctional and gotten Brown back for 3 more years, or 2 more after this one?
It, at first blush, seems to be a pretty stable offseason for the Sacramento Kings. Yes, they did not make the playoffs after failing to advance through the play-in in the 8-9 game. But they have Sabonis and Fox and Barnes and Murray and Herter. And even if you want to get deeper into it, like Trey Lyles and Sasha Vazenkov and all those guys, even Chris Duarte is under contract. So there aren't that many important Kings that are kind of in the negotiation phase right now. Now, you could, of course, see changes within that group, but I wouldn't expect, for example, Fox or Sabonis to be elsewhere. They could listen to offers on Harrison Barnes and a number of other things. So the roster, basically, they don't have those kinds of decisions. We'll, of course, talk about the big negotiation that they do have. Then the other thing that makes Sacramento a little bit different than some other teams is that for now, and for now does not mean forever, they have some wiggle room relative to the tax. And so this is not with a complete roster, but they're looking at roughly 14.5, 15 million under the tax as of now. And then actually that includes a roster hold, which would get replaced by an actual contract. So that means they theoretically they could use the full non-taxpayer mid-level, which, just so we kind of have it out there, that would be starting at 12.9 million. You could do that, but you're probably choosing, as a practical matter, between that and Malik Monk. Should that choice be yours or should that choice be his is an open question, because he's an unrestricted free agent with early bird rights. Nate, I'm not hearing you.
So let's turn to Monk now. He's the axis on which all of this stuff is going to turn, unless they really try to get into the trade market, which they could possibly do here. But Monk, the most they can offer him is 4 years, $78 million. We talked about him pretty extensively when we discussed the shooting guards, and that there could be some other teams that are interested. I don't think he's necessarily anybody's first priority. You could see possibly Detroit, right? But Detroit, Orlando, his skill set would work really well there. It doesn't seem like necessarily Philly as a cap space team. And so, but there is going to be a domino effect, right? We saw this back when a lot of teams had cap space, where if a guy goes back to his incumbent team, right? Like Paul George goes back to the Clippers. All right, well, now the next guy down the pike is maybe going to go to Philly. And so that makes it, guys going back to their incumbent teams makes it much easier for everyone else to get paid. If the big fish go elsewhere, they eat up so much money. Like Paul George is going to be $50 million basically. So that just eats up like 2 contracts for some of these other guys potentially in Philly. And maybe it gets to the point where Monk could come back. Now, we talked about this with Hartenstein too. With the early bird rights, you can't just offer him a 1+1, right? You got to offer him at least 2 years. So it might even have to be a 2+1. Monk's only 26. So some of the same analysis might apply for him as Isaiah Hartenstein, as we talked about a few days ago, where it could make more sense to do a 2+1. But here's the thing. Like, the Kings don't seem like they're going to start him. Like, it seems like they're probably going to start Keon Ellis. They don't play him that many minutes. And if I'm Monk, he hasn't ever had a big contract. He's made like, $20 million over the last couple of years, and then his rookie deal is essentially it. So I think if you probably want to take the biggest role and the biggest contract that you can get right now.
Particularly when you consider that his pathway to this point has not been the most consistent. You kind of want to, you strike while the iron is hot. You have this opportunity in your mid-20s to really get an offer and to potentially get into a good circumstance. And we don't know if Orlando or one of the other teams is going to prioritize Monk, but they at least have the opportunity to do so. And the other small consideration for Monk is, depending on what offers are out there, is there could be a circumstance where you take a shorter deal for a better opportunity and you hope that maybe you could get back there. But that is a real risk. And even though the cap is going up, and so your percentage of the cap is going to decline if you sign a 3 or 4 year deal, it's still life-changing money. And it's life-changing money for a player who has not really had that opportunity, who has not had that kind of contract yet. So I agree with you on that being part of the thesis here. And
you would offer him, 3+1 trade bonus, whatever, to get him back.
At Sacramento, yes,
on that number.
Yeah. I mean, he's the best player, because remember with Sacramento, if he leaves, all they can do is that non-taxpayer mid-level. And even if Malik Monk duplicates some of their other good players more than others, I don't know that you're going to find a perfect fit with the non-taxpayer anyway. And so the idea that you're probably getting meaningfully worse. And the Kings they're actually kind of pretty deep for a team of their quality. So they have players at multiple positions. They have guys, like Trey Lyles. Like, you don't need a third forward as desperately as some other teams would. And you and I both thought Vajenkov could actually have more opportunities. So I think Monk is the best player they can get with that salary slot, is basically the way I'm thinking about it. And so you might as well give him that. And when you consider the rising cap and everything else, that contract probably is tradable a year or two from now, should you even want to do that. But you could potentially, I mean, you brought up how he's probably not going to be starting. They still have Kevin Huerter under contract for 24, 25, and 25, 26. And it's hilarious that the contract that Monk would be signing, if he does, would be very similar in overall value to Huerter's, is that you maybe a year, 6 months from now, you're listening to offers on both those guys and you're trying to make something work, but it gives you the most flexibility as Sacramento.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really going to be Monk's decision. And, I would expect this to be one where things kind of play out. I would be surprised if we get an early announcement on him, although I have no idea how that's going to affect this market that you can now legally negotiate free agent deals to return to your team after the last day of the NBA Finals. So, and Monk is he's the only other guy on this team who can dribble, basically. He's basically their backup point guard. We saw how much he and Sabonis plays some of that role too, but you still need someone who can interact with him and attack the basket, right? I mean, they stagger Fox and Sabonis, but I mean, Fox had too much to do this year, even with Monk available. And you saw once Monk went down with that knee issue, just how limited they were in terms of just not having anyone else. He's probably going to close games for them most of the time. So they got to have him back. And if they don't have him, then you're right. They would have the full mid-level. I mean, they've got $15 million of the tax. I mean, they actually would probably go into next year in the tax unless they make some other moves. They also don't really have a backup center. Maybe that's just going to be Trey Lyles. Maybe Alex Len will come back on the minimum. Again, I
mean, they can get a minimum guy. They could also, remember, the Kings also have the 13th pick, so they could potentially solve one of their depth spots with that.
Yeah, and Sabonis, he fouls a fair amount, but he also plays a ton of minutes and rarely gets hurt. So that's not a big thing to prioritize. And some people are like, all right, well, you can trade Harrison Barnes to maybe save some money to stay under the tax if that's the route you're going. But like, they need him too, right? I mean, there's a reason why they tried to do better than him last offseason, and they just couldn't do it, right? And so they brought him back, and I guess he's 32 now. He's in decline somewhat, but he also is just like a body on the wing. He's got 2 years left, 18 and 19 million, and so they kind of need him still, I guess. So
I think the savings path is Davion Mitchell, and it may end up being a circumstance kind of like Kira Lewis was last year, but maybe it happens earlier just with one of these teams that needs to hit the salary for it, where it's like,
Detroit or somebody like that. It's like, hey, you can bring in Davion Mitchell for,
right. He's got a great brand. Danny, Bronny James said like that's who he wants to be.
So. And so Davion could potentially you bring him in as another team. So he makes 6.5 for the coming season. And so then as a potential as one of those trade partners, whether it's a trade exception or one of these cap space teams that needs the floor, then or the Kira Lewis scenario where that same thing happens but a little bit later, then Sacramento can spend what they want on Monk and get out, and they could be okay. The other scenario where that might be relevant with somebody like Davion Mitchell or theoretically Chris Duarte, but it seems like Duarte is ahead of Mitchell, even though he overlaps more aggressively if you bring Monk back, is you could potentially, if you lose Monk, deploy both the non-taxpayer mid-level and the buy of those, and then you'd probably go over the tax line a little bit, but then you save money using something small and you get back under anyway.
Yeah, and this would also, if they lose Monk, this could be a mid-level exception trade team.
Sure.
And so they retained their first, which they owed from the Kevin Huerter deal that was lottery protected, and they almost made it to lose that pick. They probably would have preferred to in this 2024 draft to open up more trading, but they can still trade a 2024 first. It's top 12 and then top 10 protected the next 2 years.
Yeah, and so you can do first allowable draft and a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, at the worst case, they could trade this year's pick, a 27, a 29, and I guess that would be a 31. So they could still trade 4 first-round picks. They got all their swaps available as well, except to the extent that it would be impacted by that pick that they owe in multiple years to Atlanta.
And while the Kings aren't they aren't necessarily impinged by the more aggressive restrictions in terms of trading rules. Like they can aggregate, they can take on aggregated salary, all that kind of fun stuff. They don't actually have a ton of matching salary depending on who you consider movable. Now, Huerter potentially gets there if you retain Monk.
I would consider all these guys movable. I mean, nobody has more than 2 years left on their deal.
Well, no. What I mean by that is like disposable salary. The players that they owe money to are players that they actually intend to keep.
I see. Well, I mean, so they've got, Lyles makes 8, Vezenkov makes 6, 7. Mitchell, you mentioned already, is in the 6s. Duarte is about 6. So, like, they could cobble those guys together. None of them are toxic, and you could lose a couple of them and not have it be the end of the world. I do think that they should try to get more out of Vezenkov than they have. I think he can actually be pretty decent for them. Although he's a good offensive fit with Sabonis, not as good defensively. Let's talk about if they lose Monk, we can talk about their free agent possibilities. I mean, they have to get another creating guard, and those are not particularly available.
Especially because you're not offering a starting spot, and you might not be offering a closing spot.
Yeah,
so Tyus Jones is probably not thrilled.
Yeah, you could probably, because Fox can defend up a little bit, although you ideally don't want him having to do that, although he has done it. But yeah, like Jones could be someone where you just say, all right, our plan is to pay you the full mid-level, and we're going to put you next to De'Aaron Fox. I mean, that just defensively, though, that makes them so small, right? I mean, and that's really difficult. And so in terms of guys who can create a little bit, I mean, that's why we have Monk kind of at the top of this group. Would Gary Trent Jr. be someone that they could bring in just to because they just need kind of more instant offense, but he doesn't create for others the way Monk does. And so it would definitely be, if you're looking on the guard line, it wouldn't be amazing. Maybe would they just want to get into the Najee Marshall business, just try to replace Barnes and just get bigger and better defensively around Sabonis? That might be something that they could do. John and I talked about, Marshall and Martin and Oubre as guys that, are going to be targeted by teams, and the Kings have always needed good defenders on the wing.
Mm-hmm.
Who can at least shoot it some. And all right, Huerter can do a little bit of pick and roll. We've seen that starting group has worked before. He can probably shoot it better than he did last year. But yeah, I mean, they definitely would be in big trouble if they lose Monk. And, it's kind of funny too, because they made the Rashawn Holmes deal in part to open up space for Monk, but now Monk might be too expensive and they're going to lose him anyway. And they'll just end up using the mid-level potentially. As far as trade targets, this, as noted, right? Like they could trade 4 firsts if they wanted to. I don't think that they would put Keegan Murray on the table because I think he's one of the advantage of drafting an older rookie is that he's like pretty good right now. He's taking big strides and he's only making 9 and 11 million the next 2 years before he's going to get a big money extension. So I think that it wouldn't make sense to move him unless you feel like, would you put Keegan Murray on the table for like a Brandon Ingram or something? I mean, that just, your long-term Bucks are like too screwed that way, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
and Ingram, like I would love to get somebody who's maybe more of a 4 who could help provide you a different defensive identity. Like maybe you could get that kind of stuff, but there isn't. I don't think of a perfect fit there. Like Jeremy Grant doesn't solve those issues to me, and so is there a like kind of a 4 that can cover up some of Sabonis' weaknesses? Now Mike Brown deserves a lot of credit for doing some scheme work on that, but it is still a lot to ask.
Yeah, Kyle Kuzma has always been linked with these guys.
Oh God.
And would Barnes and the number 13 pick for Kuzma, is that something that they would want to do? And I think because they're not as good offensively anymore, it almost kind of makes more sense to get Kuzma now, because you're not like they actually need more creation than it seemed like they did at this time last year, and particularly if they were to lose Monk, to have him be like a third offensive player. I mean, the other thing they can hope for too is just more growth from Murray as well, right? We said there's no way he could dribble. Like I don't think he's ever going to be a great passer, but he could like get into some mid-rangers more than I think he has. Like he showed some growth there. You can run him off some screens more than they have as well. So I think he'll come back better next year. Maybe he's can help them with that. So like he's their biggest hope basically, is that he's going to grow into like pretty close to an all-star level player, which I don't think is totally unrealistic.
Yeah, I think that's plausible as well. So
here's another one for you. Especially if Monk were to leave. Could they put together some of these guys for Chris Middleton and throw in some picks there?
It would surprise me if the Bucks were willing to do that at this point. Like that sort of a deal.
Well, maybe there's just a feeling the Bucks, like they got to get better defensively. They just need more depth, more guys who can play, more salaries that can kind of be broken up. I mean, maybe
but they can't aggregate. So there are potentially some they could. I guess they could make a series of smaller deals.
Well, the Bucks wouldn't need to aggregate. They would send out Middleton, and the Kings would
I'm saying they couldn't in a future deal. They would then have like a bunch of smaller pieces that they would then have to, and they can't take on money in other deals. So it would be you'd kind of have to have a vision for it. It's possible. One idea that I wanted to float, and I'm not even sure this player will be available, with the kind of the being able to trade the mid-level. The mid-level happens to be just over the salary that Brandon Clark is owed, and Clark just had an unfortunate injury-plagued season. I think Memphis wants to keep him, but there are scenarios where they're like tight on the tax or something like that. And he's, an interesting player to be a part of the rotation. And Clark he's under contract for longer than Lyles, so maybe you could eventually do something else with Lyles.
Yeah, I think the problem is just you can't play him next to Sabonis with the shooting concerns. So you probably wouldn't want to put too many resources into just a guy who's purely going to be a backup for Sabonis, even though I would like his fit there with the way he runs and stuff like that. How about, if they lost Monk, maybe just like a trade for Dennis Schroeder, who would fit into that. Let's see, would he? 13 million. It would be right on the borderline, actually, of whether he would, depending on where
it might depend
MLE
on what the
ends up.
cap line is. That's so wild that could matter.
Yeah, of whether, but they could also just send salary out for him too,
absolutely,
rather than taking him on if they wanted to go that route.
Yeah, so, like with the flexible salary matching, like they could just do Lyles conceptually. I mean, that meant, I'm not saying Brooklyn would necessarily be thrilled with that, but yeah.
Well, they would throw in it some other assets or something. I mean, the 13 pick would be too much for Dennis Schroeder, certainly, but that's kind of the guy we're looking at in this group. Malcolm Brogdon could maybe be another interesting guy as well from Portland. and Portland would need to get some cost savings there. But Brogdon is like that kind of player. He's not as reliable as Monk, obviously, not as explosive, but that sort of combo guard who could either I don't think he's as good in like the handoff game necessarily as Monk, but that could be a guy they could go after. I'm not sure what the price would be there because
it's possible that the asset, due to salary matching, it's possible that the asset cost could be lower for Sacramento because they can save Portland some real money, like because they could send out a lot less than they take back with Brogdon. If that's what Portland's going to prioritize.
How is Sac fixed for seconds? I do think Portland can probably get, as I always joke with John, like Malcolm Brogdon's destiny is to be traded for the 30th pick in the draft every year. So like I think they could do better. Like, the Kings might not have like the Goldilocks asset there.
Sacramento has basically all their own seconds and no extras. The only things are, hilariously, Sacramento has Portland's 2025 second. So maybe that's of interest to the Blazers. And then their own 2030 zone. But outside of that, and the aforementioned Kevin Huerter Atlanta obligation, Sacramento's draft coffers are pretty straightforward. They don't really have too much either direction.
If the Bulls do decide to move Alex Caruso, this could be an interesting Alex Caruso team. Like the 13 pick for Alex Caruso is like kind of along what might be fair. Now, I think the Bulls probably have a pretty deranged idea of what Caruso is worth, and particularly because this is a quote-unquote bad draft. I don't know if it's a bad draft at 13.
A Caruso Fox backcourt would be a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, and Caruso could give you a little bit of ball handling as well. Now, again, that's probably in the absence of Monk, because I don't think that, and you just get way better defensively that way as well. So yeah, I think there are some interesting options for them, but so much just depends on Monk, because if they do re-sign him, then the finances get kind of tight. And I think that, and then if you get him back, then maybe you're looking to trade for like more of a forward, and Barnes becomes the guy there as your matching salary. And maybe the Kuzma thing would finally happen. They've always been fascinating with Zach LaVine. That was maybe more of a Vlade thing, but LaVine just makes too much money to fit in. Last thing we should probably talk about, and John and I will hit on this more, I'm sure, is a potential Fox extension. He can get 3 years, and enough to push him out to what the max would be there. That would start at $51 million 2 years from now, because he signed a straight 5-year deal, and take him up to $60 million over a 3-year, basically. I guess that would be $165 million or so extension. So would you take that if you were Fox? Or are you trying to make all NBA again this year to become eligible? Because if he had made it this year, actually, he would have been eligible for the designated veteran player extension, which he is not now, but he can still, before the season, just sign a 3-year deal at the 30% max.
That's the 30% max. I would wait if I were Fox, in part because I don't see the downside risk. I mean, he's been very good over the last few years. Like he's been in all NBA consideration. And so the idea is you could potentially open that up, and you can't do triggers on this like Halliburton and Anthony Edwards did on theirs. You can't make that happen. So you might as well see where things go, add the potential of an extra year, and also see how that year goes for Sacramento. Now, we're generally seeing players get their commitments, and then you could eventually make your way out eventually. And I'm not even saying that Fox could or should do that, but you take that year, you give yourself a chance to make all NBA. And then at that point you evaluate, because it's not even like you're going to be a free agent in 2025. Like, it's still so far out that I would wait.
Yeah. And also, hey, maybe they missed the playoffs again, and it looks like they don't have much of a future, and he has 1 year left on his contract. He wants to leave. Now, he has always been extremely loyal and wanting to be in Sacramento, so I'm not saying there's even the slightest indication of that, but that's something that could happen. Let's hit a few comments here before we let's start with a deal. Can Sabonis and Keegan Murray, being your big rotation, handle the big players in the West? I think the bigger problem is kind of the rim protection aspect. Sabonis isn't bad as like a post defender, I don't think, but And Sabonis is also an excellent defensive rebounder. Like, that's the one thing that he does really contribute with defensively. So it's really more about the rim protection aspect. And Murray, it's tough for him he's done a pretty good job of it, but it's tough for him to defend on the perimeter and be your number one guy there. Maybe when Kean Ellis is out there, he can play more at forward, but he has shown some rim protection stuff. So no, I mean, that's not, if you want to actually compete to win the West, no, that's not good enough. But
they're not good enough to do that in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, Sabonis is on your team. You're not going to be good enough in those aspects anyway.
Rao said Colin Sexton would be kind of easy to get. I disagree.
That's a good one.
I like him as a fit.
That he'd be easy to get.
I don't think he'd be easy to get, but I do think he's a good fit. Potentially, unfortunately, I believe for them, so Sexton makes more than the mid-level, so they would have to send out matching salary. They don't have like an exception in that kind of range. But I mean, he would be a nice fit in terms of the supplemental creation as a potential fit there. So I like the fit, but I will disagree with the idea that he'd be easy, especially because you can make an argument that Sexton is like, he's deeper in the Jazz fabric than he would be for the Kings. And those are actually harder negotiations because like Sexton outplayed Jordan Clarkson pretty significantly last year.
Yeah, that's true. I actually should put Clarkson on my available for trade list. I might have had him down so low that I didn't see him the first time on my position rankings.
So Adil asks as a clarification, and I actually don't have the 100% answer in this. Can players and teams agree to deals after the finals or just talk? They can definitely talk. And
they can agree in principle. Same as like nobody can actually agree to a deal until the moratorium.
Exactly. That
basically, yeah, it's for players negotiating with their own teams. It's moving June 30th to the day after the finals.
Yes. Whenever that ends up being.
The Kings have all their future picks. No, they are out this pick from the Herter deal. Top 12 protected, and then top 10 protected in 25 and 26 respectively. But they can trade 4 picks still because they can move the 24 pick after the draft.
Correct.
Let's see, and then I'm gonna kind of stick with the Kings focus here.
Oh, as the Kings look forward to their books, how much should they pencil in for a Keegan Murray extension?
Yeah. Well, can I give a little context here before we say?
Of course.
So the 0 to 6 year max in the year that Keegan Murray would become a restricted free agent, it was 26-27, would start at $42.6 million. So that's the 25% max projected right now in that year. So that's just, so if he got the max, it would be $42 million in the first year, and so end up probably being, I don't think we have projected out exactly.
And if you want to know how fast these things are going up, $42 million is basically the 30% max this coming summer. That's how quickly. Yeah. So it's going to go from the 30% max to the 25% max in 2 years.
Yeah, we don't have it calculated out quite yet for that year. We'll probably get that soon, but you're looking at basically probably about
I actually have it on a year. I actually have it on my sheet. I worked on a piece for The Athletic that still has not been published on this, and I've created it for that. So my estimate is that contract would start at 42,652, and so that over a 5-year deal. So let's say it's 5 for funsies, 8% raises at a 170 cap. That will be 5 years, $247.4 million. Sounds like a lot. 25% max.
Yeah, so basically $50 million a year. Now, I would say, like, and great timeout says the Vassell McDaniels extension plus inflation. I disagree. I think actually, especially because he's a little bit older, I think he's going to come in ahead of those guys just as more of a shooter. And just we'll see. I might be wrong about him improving, but I think his second year was very, very good. I would say better than McDaniels and Vassell's second year. So, and yeah, I think for most teams, Keegan Murray is better than McDaniels because of his shooting ability. And McDaniels is better defensively for sure, but Murray, I think, is pretty solid. Like, he's definitely, like, he's not, amazing, but I think he can guard, a lot of the best guys reasonably well. We also haven't seen him with, the rim protection behind him that McDaniels has had.
Yeah.
And the shooting is just so much better.
Well, and one other proxy here is, because generally speaking, it's been those lower usage guys that have been underpaid, is that Keegan Murray this past year had his basketball reference usage rate was 18%. Jaden McDaniels' career high at any point, including before he signed an extension and after, is 15.8. So Keegan Murray already had a larger role within the offense. And this isn't just a yay points thing, but the idea that even if he's more limited on defense, that he can be a better offensive player, and there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, and just more like your market is just bigger when you can score and shoot, I think. But so I think yeah, you're looking at like minimum 35 million a year, if not more than that. For him would be in my budget.
And like there's another consideration that's going to happen here of just like depending on how these 10% bumps go, even if you and I both expect most players to the extension regime that exists now to persist, is that there could be some competitors. There could be years where you just happen to have a couple guys expiring, but they're old contracts. And so you just happen to have a bunch of space. And for Sacramento, how much flexibility they're going to have is an open question, because 26, 27, that is a big variance year for them, because while Sabonis is under contract, Fox, Barnes, Herter, and Keegan Murray, if any of them, all of their current contracts expire, Murray would be restricted. All the other ones would need to have an extension. So there's a lot of variability. I don't expect the Kings to like be a cap space team, assuming De'Aaron Fox is still around. And Murray has a pretty significant cap hold for that year. But that also means that you're not going to be getting any of those guys, Fox, most importantly, at like a holdover contract that then looks better over time. Like you're going to be getting, if it's De'Aaron Fox at 30%, you're getting him at 30% of the 26-27 cap, not the current one.
All right, we're done here?
I think we are.
All right. Well, thanks so much for everyone who commented. Please give us a like and subscribe. You can hit the notification. We'll be doing these usually live, I think at least twice a week. And of course, we'll be doing all the finals games as well on playback and with the YouTube simulcast. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you all next time. Till then.